Imagine you're standing on the bridge of a small ship, not a battleship, not a cruiser, a repurposed cargo hull with a makeshift flight deck welded on top. Your entire vessel weighs around 7,800 tons. You are there to support a landing operation. Your aircraft were armed for ground strikes. Your crew has barely trained for combat at sea. And then, just as the morning light starts to push through a gray Pacific overcast, one of your pilots radios in with a message that stops your blood cold. There are Japanese battleships on the horizon, not one, not two, 4 of them, plus 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The lead ship alone, the Yamato, displaces nearly 72,000 tons and carries 9 guns, measuring 18.1 inches across. Each shell those guns fires weighs more than 3,200 pounds, and they can reach a target 25 miles away. Your biggest gun is a 5-inch. Your maximum speed is 18 knots if you push it, and the Japanese are already firing. This is not a story about a fair fight. It's a story about what a handful of small American warships did when they had no business surviving at all. What happened off the coast of Samar Island in the Philippines on the morning of October 25, 1944, has been called one of the greatest naval upsets in history. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison wrote that in no engagement of its entire history had the United States Navy shown more gallantry, guts, and gumption than in those 2 morning hours off Samar. He wasn't exaggerating, and to understand why, you have to go back to the plan that put everyone in that position in the first place. Japan's last gamble, Operation Shogo. 1. By the autumn of 1944, Japan was losing the Pacific War in every meaningful sense. American forces had island-hopped their way across thousands of miles of ocean. Japanese air power had been devastated. The merchant shipping that kept the home islands fed and fueled was being gutted by American submarines. And now, in October 1944, General Douglas MacArthur was making good on his famous promise by landing 130,000 men on the Philippine island of Leyte. If the Philippines fell, Japan would be cut off from the oil, rubber, and raw materials of Southeast Asia. The empire would effectively be strangled. Japanese high command knew all of this, and they devised a plan. Operation Shogo 1, or Conquer Plan 1. That was breathtaking in its ambition and deeply flawed in its execution. The idea was to use what remained of the Imperial Japanese Navy in a massive, coordinated strike against the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. Not to win the war at that point, Japan's naval planners were realistic enough to know those days were gone. The goal was to inflict enough damage on the American fleet that it would delay the Philippines campaign, perhaps force some kind of negotiated peace. The plan had 3 main pieces. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's Northern Force, built around a collection of carriers that barely had enough aircraft to fill their decks, would steam down from Japan and make themselves visible to the Americans. The carriers were bait. Their job was to lure Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet, the fast carriers, the new battleships, the real teeth of American naval power, away from Leyte Gulf and off to the north, where they could be engaged and ideally destroyed. While Halsey chased the decoys, Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's Southern Force would push through Surigao Strait from the south, and Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's Center Force would come through San Bernardino Strait from the west. Both forces would converge on Leyte Gulf from opposite directions, catching the invasion fleet in a pincer and then systematically destroy the transports and landing ships packed with American men and equipment. It was a complex, coordinated plan that required everything to go right. Almost nothing went right. On October 23rd, two American submarines, the USS Dace and USS Darter, spotted Kurita's center force moving through the Palawan Passage. They attacked immediately, sinking two of Kurita's heavy cruisers and badly damaging a third. More significantly, one of those sinking cruisers was Kurita's own flagship. The admiral himself went into the water and had to be fished out and transferred to another ship. Center Force entered the coming battle with its commander having recently been swimming for his life. The following day, October 24th, American carrier aircraft found Kurita's fleet in the Sibuyan Sea and spent hours attacking it in waves. The most powerful warship Japan had ever built, the Musashi, sister ship to the Yamato, absorbed torpedo after torpedo and bomb after bomb until she finally capsized and sank. Kurita, watching his fleet bleed, turned his remaining ships around and appeared to head west. American commanders watching the situation noted his withdrawal with relief. The center force seemed to be retreating. It was not retreating. After dark on October 24th, Kurita turned his ships around again and pushed back through San Bernardino Strait. There were no American ships guarding the exit. Halsey, having taken the bait exactly as planned, had raced north with his entire force to destroy Ozawa's carriers. He left the back door open. Kurita's surviving fleet, still formidable despite its losses, slipped through in the early hours of October 25th and turned south along the coast of Samar Island, heading directly for Leyte Gulf, heading directly for the invasion fleet, heading directly for Task Unit 77.4.3, a small group of escort carriers that had absolutely no idea what was coming. A center force, what Kurita still had. Let's be very clear about what Vice Admiral Kurita was bringing with him as his fleet rounded the coast of Samar. Even after taking the submarine attacks, losing the Musashi to airstrikes, and sustaining damage to several other ships, Center Force on the morning of October 25th still consisted of 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. 23 warships in total. The entire formation displaced over 300,000 tons of steel. The flagship was the Yamato, and there has never been anything quite like the Yamato in the history of naval warfare. She displaced nearly 72,000 tons at full load, heavier than any battleship ever constructed before or since. Her three main gun turrets each weighed as much as a large destroyer. Each of her 9 18.1-inch guns could hurl a shell the size of a compact car more than 25 miles. All officers who served aboard her recalled that you needed directional arrows painted on the corridors to navigate the interior, because the ship was so vast you could genuinely lose your way. When she sailed, there was reportedly no pitch or roll even at the top of the command tower. She was that massive. Alongside Yamato came the battleships Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna, older ships but still heavily armed, each carrying 14 or 16-inch main guns that dwarfed anything the Americans in the area possessed. The heavy cruisers Chikuma, Chokai, Haguro, Kumano, Suzuya, and Tome each displaced 12,000 to 14,000 tons and carried 8-inch guns. Any one of those cruisers, alone and without support, would have been a mortal threat to the ships that were about to face them. Together, they were something that should have been simply impossible to stop. The minimum range on Yamato's main guns was already farther than the American destroyer's torpedoes could reach. The Japanese formation carried guns that could kill from 25 miles away. In theory, Kurita's fleet could have stood off at extreme range and taken the American escort carriers and destroyers apart at leisure, methodically, without ever being meaningfully threatened. That's what the math said should happen. The math was wrong. Taffy 3, the ships that were there. Task Unit 77.4.3 was known by its radio call sign, Taffy 3. It was one of three similar groups, Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3, that together made up Task Group 77.4 under Rear Admiral Thomas Sprague. The task group's job was to provide air support for MacArthur's landing operation, anti-submarine patrols, ground support missions, logistics. These were not combat ships in any traditional sense. Taffy 3 specifically was commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton A.F. Sprague, known in the Navy as Ziggy, aboard his flagship Fanshawe Bay, and it consisted of 6 escort carriers, Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinan Bay, Kitkin Bay, and Gambier Bay. These ships, officially designated CVEs, were built on merchant hulls. Their crews called them Jeep carriers or baby flat tops. Their detractors had another acronym in mind: combustible, vulnerable, expendable. They were slow, 18 knots flat out, barely able to outrun a destroyer on a good day. Thin-skinned and armed mainly with a single 5-inch gun at the stern. Their real value was their aircraft, which on the morning of October 25th had been armed for ground support missions against targets on land. Protecting those 6 carriers were 3 destroyers, USS Johnston, USS Howell, and USS Herman. Destroyers were fleet ships purpose-built for combat, but they were small, around 2,050 tons each. Each carried 5 5-inch guns and a battery of torpedoes, fast, maneuverable, and entirely outclassed by what was coming toward them. Rounding out the escort were 4 destroyer escorts: Samuel B. Roberts, Dennis, John C. Butler, and Raymond. Destroyer escorts were even smaller and slower than destroyers, built to protect convoy shipping from submarines. Their largest weapons were 2 5-inch guns and 3 torpedoes. Their crews were, in the words of the official unit history, barely trained for torpedo attacks against surface warships. Most of their combat experience, such as it was, involved hunting submarines, 13 ships, 6 of them repurposed cargo hulls with flight decks, facing 23 warships, including the largest battleship in history. When one of Taffy 3's aircraft spotted the approaching Japanese force at 6:37 in the morning and radioed the contact report back to the flagship, Rear Admiral Sprague was incredulous. He thought the pilot was confused. He demanded a second look. The pilot complied, flew closer, and confirmed. Japanese pagoda-style masts, rising unmistakably above the overcast. Battleships. Sprague's reaction, according to those on his bridge, was a stunned silence followed by the fastest set of orders anyone there could remember. The morning of October 25th. Contact. The wind was blowing from the north-northeast. There was a low overcast and scattered heavy rain squalls, the kind of weather that reduces visibility to almost nothing one moment and then opens up to miles of clear ocean the next. Taffy 3 was steaming in a rough circle about 60 miles east of Samar, launching aircraft for the morning's missions, when the Japanese opened fire at 6:58 in the morning. The first salvos from the Japanese heavy cruisers fell short. Colored dye bursts in the water, red and yellow and green, used to help spotters distinguish which ships' shells were landing where. They bracketed the American formation almost immediately. Giant columns of dyed seawater rose around the escort carriers. Then, a salvo from the Yamato herself shook the ocean close enough to White Plains that her hull rang with the near miss. Yamato's shells created waterspouts 200 feet tall. Rear Admiral Sprague immediately ordered everything Taffy 3 had. The escort carriers turned southeast at flank speed, all 18 knots of it, and launched every aircraft they could get airborne. He ordered his ships to generate smoke, the thick black chemical smoke that the destroyers and destroyer escorts could pour from their funnels and from chemical generators, creating a dense curtain that would obscure the carriers from Japanese rangefinders. He broadcast a frantic call for help to any American forces within range. And then he did something that remains remarkable even now. He ordered his destroyers to attack, not to lay smoke and evade, not to cover a retreat, to attack. In their planning, the men who designed Shogo 1 had never seriously entertained the possibility that ships this small would choose to charge. The Japanese gunnery officers, training their rangefinders on the targets ahead of them, had never anticipated this. Nobody had. Commander Evans and the charge of the Johnston. At the moment the Japanese opened fire, Commander Ernest Evans was on the bridge of the USS Johnston. Evans was 36 years old, Cherokee and Creek by heritage, born in Pawnee, Oklahoma, who had beaten considerable odds just to reach the Naval Academy and graduate with the class of 1931. He was known throughout the destroyer force as a fighter. At the commissioning of the Johnston a year before, he had told the assembled crew plainly and without drama, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." When the Japanese opened fire on Taffy 3 on the morning of October 25th, Evans did not wait for orders. He turned Johnston hard to port, accelerated to flank speed, and charged the Japanese fleet. On his own initiative, without consulting Sprague, without waiting for the formal attack order that came moments later, Evans aimed his 2,050-ton destroyer at 4 battleships and 6 heavy cruisers, and drove her straight at them. Johnston's gunnery officer, Lieutenant Robert Hagen, opened fire on the nearest Japanese heavy cruisers when they were still 8.9 miles away. The destroyer was getting underway at full speed, zigzagging through the incoming shell fire, and her 5-inch guns were landing hits on the Japanese cruisers almost immediately. The cruisers swung their guns onto the approaching destroyer. The battleships Nagato and Haruna fired their main batteries at her. Yamato's secondary battery sent 19 shells in Johnston's direction. Somehow, none of it hit her. Evans closed to within 10,000 yards of the heavy cruiser Kumano and ordered the torpedo battery launched. Johnston fired all 10 of her torpedoes. At least one, probably 2 or 3, struck Kumano directly, blowing the cruiser's entire bow off. Kumano was forced out of the battle, and her escort ship Suzuya had to follow to render assistance, removing 2 of the 6 heavy cruisers from the fight before it had properly begun. Then Yamato found Johnston with her secondary battery. 3 18.1-inch shells and 3 6.1-inch shells hit the destroyer almost simultaneously. The explosions tore open her engine spaces, knocked out her gyro compass, blew off 2 of Evans's fingers, and stripped the shirt from his body. Evans refused morphine and refused to leave the bridge. He directed damage control with 2 fingers gone, steering Johnston with sheer force of will, continuing to fight. Over the next 2.5 hours, the Johnston absorbed a punishment that no ship her size was designed to survive and kept fighting. She interposed herself between the Japanese cruisers and the fleeing carriers again and again. When her torpedoes were gone, she used her guns. When her guns were failing, she used what was left. At one point, Evans spotted a Japanese destroyer formation making a torpedo attack run at the escort carriers and moved Johnston to intercept, pouring fire into the enemy formation until they launched early and missed. Eventually, the hits accumulated past any possibility of recovery. Her last 5-inch gun was destroyed. Her forward funnel was blown off. her boilers went out. Commander Evans was last seen on the stern of his burning, sinking destroyer, still shouting firing orders through an open hatch to men turning the rudder by hand. He was not among those rescued. The Johnston sank just after 10 in the morning. Of her 327 crew, 186 were lost. As she went under, a Japanese destroyer came alongside. Her captain, observing the wreckage, has saluted the Johnston's crew. The survivors, watching from the water, saw it happen and never forgot it. The rest of the fleet joins the charge. Evans and the Johnston had not charged alone for long. Sprague's formal order to his destroyers, "Small boys, make attack," brought the Hoel and Heermann into the fight as well, and then came the order that none of the destroyer escort captains had trained for, and that all of them obeyed without hesitation. Commander Robert Copeland of the USS Samuel B. Roberts assembled his crew before his ship made her attack run. He told them plainly, "This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." He wasn't being theatrical, he was being accurate. And then Samuel B. Roberts, a 1,350-ton destroyer escort built to hunt submarines, armed with 2 5-inch guns and 3 torpedoes, turned toward the Japanese fleet and attacked. The Samuel B. Roberts earned a reputation that day that far outlasted her hull. She pressed her torpedo attack through withering fire, fired her 3 torpedoes, scored at least 1 hit, and then kept fighting with her guns long after her torpedoes were gone. Her crew fired 608 rounds from her 5-inch guns in under an hour. She took direct hits from 14-inch shells that opened her hull like a tin can. When she finally sank, she had expended virtually all of her ammunition. She was later nicknamed the destroyer Escort that fought like a battleship. It stuck. Meanwhile, the USS Hoel, one of the 3 destroyers, launched her torpedoes at Congo, forcing that battleship to take evasive action and temporarily disrupting the Japanese formation. She then turned and made a second torpedo attack against the cruiser Haguro before Japanese shells put her out of action. A Hoel took about 40 hits from shells ranging from 5-inch to 16-inch. She lost 252 of her crew. The USS Heermann, the 3rd destroyer, survived the battle despite charging through the midst of the Japanese formation and firing 7 torpedoes at the cruiser Haguro. At one point, Heermann fired her guns at the battleship Congo while maneuvering around the sinking Hoel, threading through the chaos with extraordinary skill. She ended the battle with 6 of her crew dead, a remarkable outcome given the circumstances. The Yamato herself was forced to take evasive maneuvers when Johnston's and Heermann's torpedoes crossed ahead of her bow, and the great battleship actually turned and ran north for several minutes to avoid them. That evasion put Yamato out of position for a critical phase of the battle and contributed to the disorganization that increasingly plagued the Japanese force. The carriers fight back, planes, smoke, and chaos, while the destroyers and destroyer escorts were doing things that shouldn't have been survivable. The 6 escort carriers were doing everything they possibly could from their end of the battle. They were launching aircraft continuously throughout the engagement. Every plane that could get airborne was in the air attacking the Japanese ships. Here was the problem. Those aircraft had been armed for ground support that morning. Anti-personnel bombs, rockets, ammunition belted for strafing runs against dug-in infantry. Not the armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes you'd want against battleships and cruisers. The pilots made do. They pressed attacks on the Japanese ships with whatever they had. 500-pound general-purpose bombs, rockets, even strafing runs with the nose guns on their Avenger torpedo bombers. When a plane ran out of ammunition, and it sometimes made dry runs, fake attack passes, just to force the Japanese gunners to keep evading and maneuvering. Aircraft from Taffy 2, further south, joined the fight as well. The coordination wasn't perfect, the weapons weren't ideal, but the constant aerial harassment was driving the Japanese formation to distraction. Japanese battleships and cruisers trying to close on the fleeing carriers were perpetually dodging or returning anti-aircraft fire. The very act of maneuvering constantly disrupted their formation and their fire control. The smoke screens helped enormously. The thick black chemical smoke that Sprague had ordered laid down early in the battle obscured the carriers from Japanese rangefinders for crucial stretches of time. Visibility was further complicated by the rain squalls moving through the area. The Japanese gunnery, despite the enormous size advantage of their guns, was frequently disrupted by smoke and rain. Whole minutes went by when the Japanese couldn't accurately place the American ships. They fired enormous quantities of ammunition and achieved fewer hits than they should have. And there was something else happening on the Japanese side that was beginning to turn the tide. Kurita's strange decision. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita had been through 3 days of unrelenting punishment by the time his fleet rounded Samar. He had nearly drowned when his flagship was torpedoed. He had watched the Musashi, the most powerful battleship afloat, die under American air attack. He had sailed through San Bernardino Strait in the dark without knowing whether Halsey might be waiting on the other side. He was exhausted, his staff was exhausted, his fleet was damaged, and the communications that should have told him Ozawa's decoy mission had succeeded, that Halsey was indeed gone, had never reached him. So when his fleet engaged, what he was told was a small group of escort carriers with a destroyer screen. Kurita processed the battle through the lens of a man who expected the worst. The ferocity of the American destroyer attacks convinced him he was facing something much larger and more dangerous than a handful of escort carriers. His staff officers were telling him these were fleet carriers and Baltimore-class cruisers. The destroyers charged so aggressively that Japanese ships reported them as heavy cruisers. The escort carriers appeared to be making 30 knots, probably an optical distortion. Kurita believed with increasing conviction that he was tangling with part of Halsey's Third Fleet. At 9:11 in the morning, with 3 of his cruisers sunk or crippled by air attack, his formation disorganized by constant torpedo threats and smoke screens, and his belief hardening that he was walking into a trap, Kurita ordered his fleet to break off the engagement and regroup. He sent his ships north, away from Leyte Gulf. On the bridge of the Fanshawe Bay, a signalman who had been tracking the Japanese formation turned to Rear Admiral Sprague and said something that Sprague remembered for the rest of his life. "God damn it, boys, they're getting away." Sprague, who had been grimly expecting to die at any moment, reportedly couldn't believe it. Kurita's decision to withdraw remains one of the most debated in naval history. His critics, including some of his own officers, accused him of cowardice. His defenders pointed out that he had been fed nothing but bad information, that his force had suffered serious losses, and that he had legitimate reason to believe he was engaging a much stronger enemy force than was actually there. He later admitted that his second decision, turning back from Leyte Gulf entirely around noon, was probably a mistake. And he wrote afterward that he believed advancing into the Gulf would have meant destruction without meaningful result. He was perhaps right in the strategic sense. But on that particular morning, off Samar, the Americans who survived would spend the rest of their lives wondering how those ships had managed to drive off the most powerful surface fleet Japan had ever assembled. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, who watched the entire thing from Pearl Harbor via desperate radio messages from Kincaid, wrote later that the outcome was nothing short of special dispensation from the Lord Almighty. Aftermath: sharks, silence, and the cost. The shooting stopped, but the dying continued for 2 more days. Taffy 3 had lost 2 escort carriers. Gambier Bay, sunk by Japanese gunfire, and St. Lo, which survived the surface battle only to be struck by a kamikaze aircraft immediately afterward, the second organized kamikaze attack of the war. St. Lo went down in a series of internal explosions just 25 minutes after the kamikaze hit. The destroyers Johnston and Hoel were gone. The destroyer Escort Samuel B. Roberts was gone. The surviving crews of those 4 ships went into the water, and due to a combination of communication failures and reluctance to expose rescue ships to potential Japanese submarine attack, those men were not rescued until October 27th, 2 full days after the battle ended. Hundreds of men floated in the Philippine Sea for 48 to 72 hours without food or fresh water, under a tropical sun, in waters that were not empty. Sharks found them. Survivors who lived to tell the story described watching their shipmates taken in the water, the agonizing calculus of letting the dead drift away at night so they wouldn't attract more sharks to the living. Some men, maddened by thirst, drank seawater and lost their minds. Others maintained remarkable composure in conditions that defy imagination. When a landing craft finally came alongside, while her captain identified the survivors by shouting a question through a megaphone and waiting for the answer only Americans would know. One survivor, Jack Hewson from the Samuel B. Roberts, remembered his small group yelling back the ship's name. They were pulled aboard, Total American losses in the battle off Samar: over 1,000 killed and missing, 913 wounded. Those numbers, from a force of 13 small ships, were comparable to the combined American losses at the Coral Sea and Midway put together. The Japanese lost 3 heavy cruisers sunk: Chikuma, Chokai, and Suzuya, with 3 others damaged. The Kumano, her bow blown off by Johnston's torpedoes early in the fight, limped away and was eventually sunk the following month by American submarines and aircraft. Yamato had been forced to flee her own torpedoes. Nagato, Kongo, and Yamato herself were all damaged by bomb hits and near misses during the pursuit that followed Kurita's withdrawal. Nearly 2,700 Japanese sailors died. Kurita's center force returned to Japan through San Bernardino Strait. It never conducted a major combat operation again. The Battle of Leyte. Gulf as a whole was the last time the Imperial Japanese Navy operated as a coherent fleet. It had sailed from Brunei with enough firepower to potentially alter the course of the Pacific War. It came home with its back broken. Legacy: what it all meant. The battle off Samar lasted roughly 2.5 hours of serious fighting. In that time, a collection of ships built for convoy escort and ground support had absorbed the first hours of an attack by the most powerful surface fleet Japan had ever assembled, and had not merely survived, they had caused enough damage, confusion, and disruption to drive that fleet away without completing its mission. The 130,000 men of the Sixth Army on Leyte Island never knew how close things had come, and the transports and landing ships that were the supposed targets of Operation Shogo 1 were never attacked. MacArthur's landing proceeded. The Philippines campaign continued. The road to Japan remained open. Commander Ernest Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, one of only 2 American destroyer captains to receive that decoration in the entire war. He was the first Native American in the United States Navy to be so honored. His citation reads, in part, that he was the first to lay a smokescreen and to open fire as an enemy task force, vastly superior in number, firepower, and armor, rapidly approached. The Medal of Honor was accepted by his widow, Margaret, in September 1945. His 2 sons were present. The entire task unit received the Presidential Unit Citation. In the decades that followed, the ships themselves became legendary. The USS Johnston was found in 2019 lying on the bottom of the Philippine Sea beneath 4 miles of water. At that point, the deepest shipwreck ever discovered. The Samuel B. Roberts was later found deeper still at nearly 23,000 feet in 2022. The men who crewed those ships had come, in the words of one historian, from small places to accomplish big things. The sailors who floated in the Philippine Sea for 3 days, who fired torpedoes at battleships from destroyer escorts never designed for it, who made dry bombing runs when their ammunition was exhausted just to keep the pressure on. Most of them were young men who had joined the Navy from small towns and had never intended to become the last line of defense between the Imperial Japanese Navy and a beachhead full of American soldiers. They had no way of knowing when the battle started that they would succeed. The math said they wouldn't. The tonnage said they couldn't. The guns said they should have been annihilated in the first 20 minutes. They charged anyway, and somehow, improbably, furiously, on with smoke and torpedoes and a level of courage that naval historians are still writing about 80 years later, they held. If this story moved you the way it moves me every time I come back to it, please hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who've never heard of Taffy 3 or Commander Evans or the Samuel B. Roberts. And subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. These stories are out there, waiting. Men who did things the history books barely mention, who held on in situations nobody should have survived. If you have a family connection to Leyte Gulf, a grandfather, an uncle, anyone who was there, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Their names matter, they still do.